Even since the time of the first civilizations such as Babylonia, there's always been disputes over land, resources, and food, and even politics. And the United States has always had a reason to dispute over governments and ways of life. The 1960s came around and America once again intervened into world affairs. Now we are involved in a similar war in Afghanistan on terror, and the similarities are certainly present, and the result is proving to be too. Our policy of containment is what brings us first into Vietnam, which we think we can stall the spread of communism and keep Indochina out of the domino effect. And we clearly underestimate the power of guerrilla warfare in Vietnam.
See, the fear of communism in Indochina really gets us into the war in Vietnam. It's a fascinating topic. I mean, the fear of communism brought upon our containment theory, and after that, Vietnam being taken by Japan would lead to our domino effect. If Vietnam was taken, then Laos, Cambodia, and all the other countries around it would also be taken, and Asia would become fully communist.
The source of our struggles in Afghanistan clearly stemmed from Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. It started with an attack on the U.S. soil in 9/11, which obviously everyone knows about, and the Taliban is clearly feeding Al-Qaeda to be in existence in Afghanistan with no pretenses on what they can or can't do. It's really sad, and someone needs to stop it. Al-Qaeda is probably the biggest reason we were put into the Afghanistan war. The threat of Al-Qaeda is big in our standards. They are nurtured by the Taliban, which is a government that we definitely do not like. They nurtured the Al-Qaeda, who of course are terrorists, and they are willing to protect them and do anything for them. They are very deep into the Afghanistan soil and hard to take down. They are religiously loyal and are very hard to penetrate. Both these wars are put on our plates by what we consider governments that are threatening our democracy. And we do not believe in communism or any corrupt government other than democracy. On a different note, what we bring to Vietnam is nasty. We have a new generation of chemical warfare, and we depend on more modern technology. And what really hurts us is we have no experts on the Vietnamese culture or their way of life, which definitely bites us in the end.
When we went into war with Vietnam, it was expected to be an easy fight. However, it was quite the opposite, and the war was very hostile. The U.S. Army went into the war with no knowledge of Vietnam's culture and terrain, which was a big factor why we lost. We also depended on modern weaponry, which ended up hurting us. We tried to go on search and destroy missions, but we usually ended up finding nothing. We also used a lot of chemical weapons, including napalm and phosphorus. This didn't help because the Viet Cong outsmarted us with their hidden tunnels that they used to avoid the U.S.
Just as the Vietnamese gave us rough fighting, the Afghanis didn't do much worse. They gave us tons of mountains and deserts that are very tough to fight in, and the infamous Pashtun mountain range, where once again we rely on our technology, which comes back to haunt us. Afghanistan and Vietnam give the U.S. two very tough environments to fight in. Vietnam, obviously infamous for its jungle environment, and Afghanistan is a very rough desert mountainous terrain. We had done a splendid job in fighting Al-Qaeda and their leader Osama bin Laden. We had them pinned in the Pashtun mountain range, which is a just terrible place to live on earth, just dry, hot, mountainous, just terrible. And we were fighting undermanned. We're inexperienced on how to fight in mountain warfare. We rely much too heavily on our technology, which definitely gets us into trouble against unorthodox fighters like the Viet Cong from North Vietnam, and some in South Vietnam, of course, and the Al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan. The main similarities in both wars and how we fought lie within the terrain. Although they weren't the same, they both gave us challenges that we obviously couldn't overcome to defeat both countries. Our loss in Vietnam started with Lyndon B. Johnson and the signing of the Gulf-Tonkin Resolution of 1964. The most embarrassing defeat in U.S. history started that day and will never be forgotten. And it ended with Nixon just as bad as he went out of office, and quite frankly, this war is one of the utter embarrassments of U.S. history.
We lost in Vietnam because of many factors. One is because we didn't know the culture and we did not win the peace with the people. Another is because of our inexperienced commanders and they didn't know how to fight in the jungle terrain of Vietnam. We also didn't have any experts in the field of Vietnam to help us translate what the people wanted and how we could help them fight the Viet Cong.
Our struggles in Afghanistan started with President Bush and still lie today with Barack Obama nearly 10 years later. We are still yet to fix the government of the Afghan people and stabilize the Taliban.
The thing that makes the two wars, the Afghanistan and the Vietnam War, so fascinating and comparable is the reasons of why we're losing. I mean, in the 60s, it was the same thing as in the 2000s. There's no problem with defeating the Taliban army and the Viet Cong, but the problem is winning the peace. If you can't win a peace in a war like this, you're probably not going to win. Also, we haven't successfully destroyed the whole Taliban government. Many people think we did, but we just haven't, and there's still Taliban governors on the rise in Afghanistan.
It is not hard to see that we can defeat any country in the world, but the problem lies in our ability to win the peace with people. We do not take into account that we should learn their culture, or maybe even perhaps learn a little bit of their language and send specialists in to see what they want. We're too busy thinking about ourselves too much, and that clearly happens in both wars. Our struggles abroad in Vietnam and currently Afghanistan do not just stay overseas. They're at home with protests, and in Vietnam's case, new types of people wanting to go against the war.
There's no doubt Afghanistan and Vietnam both left problems at home, even though they were fought on the other side of the world. You see, with Vietnam, they had many protests, a lot from college students, anywhere, from the range of 18 to 24 in that range. I mean, there was maybe a couple people from older generations, but mostly young people trying to support for the draft of their young peers who were going into the war when they didn't even sign up. And of course, chemical warfare, as far as phosphorus, napalm, Agent Orange, things like that. And what you see now in Afghanistan is what you see about the president. People are starting to lose a lot of support for the president because he is not leaving, and the party as a whole. As we've seen, the House has been taken over by the Republicans now, as always before it's been by the Democrats with Obama. But one more thing about Vietnam was counterculture. The war created a counterculture, otherwise known as the hippies, who thought that they could stop the war and they wanted peace by the use of drugs. So you can clearly see in both wars that there's definitely effects at home. And don't forget that there is things every day that the Afghanistan war at home. We have protests for our troops because we know what happened in Vietnam is just a terrible thing, that we don't support our troops when they come home, and everybody, we just want them to get out of there, and we want to make sure we have their full support when they leave and get back into the United States of America.
While it may not seem at first glance, both wars present an abundance of similarities. They were both fought against governments that we definitely do not approve of. We fought them both completely wrong, and they both left big effects here at home in the United States of America. Although in 30 years when we look back we might not want to remember about these wars, we need to remember now that we need to support our troops when they come home and make sure they feel at home and they are not treated like they once were when they came home from Vietnam.